Good evening y bienvenidos to Chicago Tonight Latino Voices. I'm Alex Hernandez of Noticias Univision Chicago. We cherish every weekday morning at 5 and 6. Thank you for sharing part of your weekend with us. On the show tonight, disinformation campaigns aimed at Latinos are becoming increasingly common. What you need to know to avoid it. Prostate cancer is the most commonly diagnosed cancer among Latino men. We talk about what symptoms to look out for. A documentary love letter to the Southeast Side screening at an art gallery next week. And a Chicago playwright is paying tribute to a community that raised him in a new production in Pilsen. All that coming up, but our first story tonight, disinformation ahead of Tuesday's election. That's right after this.
Chicago Tonight, Latino Voices, is made possible in part by the support of these donors.
Latinos are the fastest growing racial and ethnic group in the U.S. electorate since the last midterm elections. 34 million Latinos are eligible to vote, making them a crucial demographic for politicians. But Latinos are also increasingly the target for disinformation campaigns. According to X research, 70% of Latinos use social media as a primary source of political and election news, where fact-checking in Spanish is sparse. And young Latinos are more than twice as likely as the general population to use messaging apps like WhatsApp and Telegram, which also lack fact-checking. Joining us now with more are Laura Trejo, Senior Director of Strategic Initiatives for Latinos Progresando, Jaime Dominguez, Political Science Professor at Northwestern University, Cristina Tardaguila, Senior Research Manager at the International Center for Journalists, and Liz Lebron, Research Manager for the Voto Latinos Disinformation Lab. And I want to welcome all of you for joining us today. And I want to start with you, Jaime. What makes Latinos in the U.S. rather susceptible to disinformation?
Well, I think that first and foremost, in terms of just where they receive their news and where they consume their news, Pew Hispanic just came out with a report that actually showed that the internet and the various platforms, whether it's Facebook or YouTube, that they now compete with television for Latinos receiving their news. So as we've known, there's been very little or just very lackadaisical oversight over those platforms. And so Latinos become very susceptible in that way. And the way I see it is that, when they receive wrong information, then, in many ways that can lead them to disengage from the party and disengage from politics. Sometimes that may be done on purpose, particularly if you look at just what's happening nationwide in these competitive states. You see that is actually happening either through PACs or through other avenues, but that there's ways in which they're trying to just confuse Latinos. So, for example, even like where to vote, how to vote, right? What times do the polls close? Has your precinct been moved? Right, we've heard reports where that actually Latinos are receiving the wrong information, and so the way I see it, again, it's a kind of a form of like voter suppression if you really think about it.
Laura, locally, what ways have you seen disinformation actually play out in Latino communities in recent years?
Latinos Progresando is a primarily immigration legal services organization. And so during the pandemic, we also became COVID experts in a sense because we needed to. But I would say our community has seen a lot of fraud in the immigration communication that's out there. There are a lot of predatory entities, notary publics, even attorneys making false claims. And I think that has really serious repercussions for immigration status. But even COVID, I think, offered a really stark health implications for individuals as well.
Definitely. Liz, can you explain to us the difference between disinformation and misinformation and how both are a problem among Latinos when it comes to understanding their voting rights?
At its core, it's really a matter of intent. All of us have wrong information about certain things, and we may share that, and it may not have malicious intent behind it, Somebody could possibly be confused about where their polling location is, for example, or have questions about the vaccine. Laura brings up an excellent point. It's not just election related. Anything that sows mistrust in, the political process, political organizations, political government entities can sow distrust in the electoral process. So disinformation is really more about intent, anything that tries to purposely sow that doubt in the process.
Cristina, what would you say are the red flags that indicate information is not trustworthy?
Well, when you lack the source, right? So I invite all our audience to actually ask a few questions every time you receive a piece of content. So do you know where it's coming from? Do you see the source of that information? Are you sure this is something new? Because some old stuff is being revamped and as it was happening today. Can we know a bit about the author? Is this person or this organization really specialized in election, for example? And if it's not, then we should just disregard. So there are some easy ways to verify content that anyone can do.
Cristina, your organization actually is offering fact-checking resource in Spanish. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Sure. Well, ICFJ is happy to support Fact Chequeado, which is a brand new fact-checking organization in the United States. It's what has been created by two amazing women. One is from Argentina and one from Spain. And they're right now offering and building this amazing collaborative project, bringing together all the organizations, all the news media organizations that are currently fact-checking content and publishing fact checks in Spanish. So the idea of having a big alliance and being able to verify, to assess the quality of content that is being spread in Spanish in the United States, focusing in the Hispanic and the Latino community is the goal of Fact Chequeado. And they have great articles. I just read one right now about what are these 10 falsehoods that are coming during this election period. And I think Jaime has shared some of them, but there are a bunch of stories that we know are false.
Actually, and I'm going to Jaime right now, actually. Could you tell us, Jaime, what responsibility do social media companies actually have in the U.S. for combating disinformation campaigns?
Well, I think since their footprint has become a lot larger and is now, obviously a huge footprint in the political process, I think they have an obligation to their consumers to make sure that the information that they're putting out is actually accurate. You shouldn't be in a situation where you have, for example, the Congressional Hispanic Caucus, right? Making sure that they put pressure on Twitter and Facebook and YouTube to make sure that there's oversight. And what we have seen so far is when that's discussed, it's always about just English language. Very little is there discussion about Spanish language. I mean, that's even, it gets more, our community becomes more vulnerable just because of the issue. Perhaps, maybe there are a lot of incorrect messaging when it comes to Spanish. In fact, we just had an example. There was a representative in the House of the state of Virginia. He wrote to the governor because he went on the State Board of Elections, went to the Spanish division within that, and found out a horrid number of incorrect information about elections. What time polling places closed, how to actually register to vote. So it's problematic.
Speaking of Spanish, speaking of language, Laura, what role does language play in disinformation?
I mean, in Chicago, we still have a lot of communities that speak primarily Spanish. And so I think putting resources towards translating in Spanish is hugely important. But I think also having some cultural vetting of Spanish language productions is also important, right? If something is popped into a Google Translator of sorts, you also get a lot of really unclear messaging.
Definitely. Well, our time, unfortunately, it's coming up, but I want to ask you this last question, Liz. You say disinformation campaigns play in stereotypes about Latinos. Can you explain a little bit? We have a very limited time.
Absolutely. There's a big difference, for example, in saying, I think there might be voter fraud and saying, oh, votes were illegally cast in California. That really puts a target on the Latino community, because when you say votes were illegally cast, it's usually some sort of stereotypical caricature of an undocumented person. And that really puts a target. It's not only disinfo that's targeting our community, it's also about us. So we have to deal with it in two different levels.
Cristina, disinformation is a problem not just in the U.S., as you know, but all over Latin America as well. Can you give us an idea of how disinformation in the U.S. is connected with disinformation abroad?
Oh, absolutely. And I was just researching about it. For example, we just had election in Brazil last week, and you can totally see how the Stop the Steal, for example, narrative that was big in the United States in 2020, it has landed there. The same thing happened in Costa Rica. The same thing happened in Colombia. So at the same time, the disinformers from the United States are using Latin America as labs and getting the results to reapply it here. So unfortunately, there are no borders for this information.
Definitely. Well, we need to be informed, but we need to get it from the right sources, definitely. Our thanks to Laura Trejo, Jaime Dominguez, Cristina Tardáguila, and Liz LeBron. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Up next, identifying prostate cancer. Stay with us. If some of the men in your life or some of the men you know are sporting a little more facial hair than usual, like me, they might be participating in No Shave November, a campaign to increase prostate cancer awareness. According to statistics from the Prostate Cancer Foundation, prostate cancer is the most commonly diagnosed cancer among Latino men. They say issues like a lack of access to consistent health care, as well as language and cultural barriers, all contribute to the more than 17,000 diagnoses and 2,000 deaths annually among Latino men. Joining us now with more are Dr. Luis Rivera, who practices in the Department of Family and Community Medicine at UI Health, Frank Medina, a medical student and member of the organization Latinos United for Cancer Education, Research, and Outreach, and Dr. Hitin Patel, Assistant Professor of Urology at the Northwestern University School of Medicine. Thank you all for joining us, but I want to start with you, Dr. Rivera. Could you walk us through some of the symptoms of prostate cancer, please?
Well, unfortunately, a lot of times symptoms are very vague, or some people have no symptoms at all. But definitely, if somebody has blood in the urine or blood in their sperm or difficulty urinating, things like that, we should at least raise your suspicion.
Okay,
But,
so those are just some of the red flags, right? What is like a major red flag that would say you definitely need to see your doctor now?
Well, I mean, I think if you're having trouble urinating, urinary retention, so sometimes people present with at later stages where they have, unable to urinate at all, and that would be like a very red, advanced stage. But it could be, that could not necessarily be cancer. It could also be just what we call benign. It could be just benign hypertrophy. But those are the kind of things we worry about.
Right, but it would be enough to go to your doctor, definitely. Speaking of the exam, is the digital rectal exam still standard screening?
Not the standard, right, as of right now. Right now, there's more of an emphasis on the PSA, prostate-specific antigen test, and plus or minus a digital rectal exam. So the USPSTF, which is the United States Preventive Services Task Force, is kind of leaning more towards the blood test and plus or minus the digital rectal exam.
Okay, and this is important because as Latino men, there's a lot of taboos regarding the exam for prostate cancer, so that's important to know. Thank you, doctor. Frank Medina, what do you think is behind the disparities in prostate cancer outcomes among Latino men?
Yeah, it's a great question and important to address. So, among Latino men, they're less likely to develop or test positive for prostate cancer, but more likely to die from prostate cancer. It's about 2.9% lifetime risk of dying from prostate cancer among Latino men. It's also important to highlight the disparities among African American Black men, about 4% from dying from prostate cancer. But if you look at healthcare coverage of Latinos, Latina people, men specifically in the United States, about 30% of Latino men don't have normal, steady access to care or have a primary care physician. So that's another issue when we look at, where healthcare coverage is provided for people that may not have access to care in their neighborhood or aren't able to afford health insurance, or from their citizenship status, not able to get, to see the people and the physicians that they need to. Also cultural barriers and differences in that as well. If you look at people with Mexican heritage or born from Mexico, 30% have no healthcare coverage. But then you look at people from Cuba, and about 20% don't have healthcare coverage. So it's important to look at the different subgroups of people.
Definitely. And then this also will take us about treatment. Dr. Patel, once someone is unfortunately diagnosed with prostate cancer, what are the options for treatment?
Yeah, so we actually have very good treatments for prostate cancer for both localized and even if it's spread. And so the standard options would be surgery or radiation. And both of these therapies are highly curative for men who have localized prostate cancer. If there's prostate cancer that's spread outside the prostate, then we also use hormonal therapy. And hormonal therapy is not a chemotherapy, but it's something that suppresses men's testosterone and it keeps prostate cancer cells from growing. And prostate cancer feeds on testosterone. So if you have a prostate cancer that's spread, that's often the best way to keep it under control.
Is it the same treatment for any of the stages of prostate cancer? What would it differ, let's say, for a patient with a stage cancer 4?
Yeah, so for a stage 4 cancer, we rely on our hormonal therapy. Usually, sometimes doing surgery or radiation could help, but most of the time, when you have spread to your bones or lymph nodes, doing the hormonal therapy will keep it under control. And in the last 5 to 10 years, we actually have, and our medical oncologists have, newer agents that help improve men's life and kind of improve their survival, even if they've had spread to the bone or lymph nodes. And so really we have to think about it as not a chemotherapy, doesn't have those kind of side effects, but the hormonal therapy is very good. So that's the newer kind of agents, but they rely on the same mechanism and the same principles as the older therapies we had.
Thank you, doctor. Going back with you, Dr. Rivera, the approach for screening and diagnosis has changed over the years, as you know. Can you explain why doctors might not want to intervene with some prostate cancers?
Well, sometimes because the overall incidence of mortality is overall low. So that's why sometimes there's an approach called watchful waiting, where somebody is considered average or low risk. You might just monitor, with maybe what we call serial PSA testing. So that might be the approach for some patients. And then and also there's, shared decision making. So you discuss with the patient, okay, if we proceed with a biopsy, even a biopsy can have significant side effects and what we call comorbidities. They can have erectile dysfunction, trouble urinating after just the biopsy. So through the process of shared decision making, some patients may also just opt out of going forward with either biopsy or a prostatectomy, which is a removal of the prostate. So I think all those factors play a role in why some urologists would not intervene. Yeah.
Frank, you were just mentioning about healthcare, for some of the patients, but what about the cultural and social factors that prevent Latinos from getting better care?
Yeah, we all know about machismo, among Latino men, about being, strong and not asking for help from people. And it really kind of comes down to the family unit. If you have children or brothers and sisters or parents that are able to support you and really encourage you to go get help when you're feeling symptoms. Even sometimes with my dad has hypertension, and I tell Dad, you can take your pastillas with your licuados, but just keep taking your pills, right? So there's different cultural barriers. It's important to talk about like homophobia and also to preconceived notions people might have where, hey, if I'm gonna go check my prostate out, someone's gonna give me a digital rectal exam, and like Dr. Rivera just said.
It still exists, right?
And it still exists.
Those beliefs.
And those beliefs exist, but it's about having a conversation and really saying, hey, like you should just seek medical care in general, right?
That's where family comes in.
That's where family is so important.
We have less than a minute, but I want to go back with you, Dr. Patel, just real quick, if you can tell us the lifestyle risk factors associated also with prostate cancer. We have about 30 seconds, doctor.
Yeah, so I think there are a few things that have been studied. So one is just high increase in kind of red meat intake has been shown to be a little bit more associated with prostate cancer, developing it. But having a healthy diet in general, even for men like, that was mentioned, if we're on a watchful waiting or active surveillance for prostate cancer, healthy green leafy vegetables, broccoli, those kind of diet, fruity vegetables, those kind of things are shown to help prevent cancers in general, but also prostate cancer.
Definitely. Well, our thanks to Dr. Luis Rivera, Frank Medina, and Dr. Hitin Patel. Thank you all. Thank you for joining us today.
Yeah, thank you.
The southeast side of Chicago was once the largest producer of steel in the world. But through the 1970s and 80s, those communities were hollowed out when the steel mills left. Through interviews with his grandfather and others who lived through the neighborhood's rise and fall, filmmaker Stephen Walsh shows what he says is the forgotten story of the southeast side in his documentary, Southeast, a city within a city.
A lot of people have told the story of the steel mills, but what interested me more so was what happened to these individuals once they closed. And to me, that's where you see the rise of the gangs. That's where you see, you know, a lot of the issues of violence. That's the landscape that I grew up in. So for my grandfather to describe the same streets that I describe as horrible, he would describe them as wonderful, magical even. I just thought that was so fascinating because it's only a generation in between us that we went from this paradise to this land of sacrifice.
It was beautiful here once and full of life. There was always something to do, somewhere to go, dances and block parties and fests and lights and magic.
What I want people to know from our community is how beautiful it is. You know, I grew up and I was embarrassed to say I was from the Southeast Side. But now after doing all this research and making this film, I'm so freaking proud of it. Because those who didn't leave, they have this spirit in them that I think is wonderful and I just don't see anywhere else.
Southeast, City Within a City, is screening at Intuit Center for Intuitive and Outsider Art on November 12th. You'll find more on that on our website as well. For Chicago, by Chicago. That's how a local playwright describes a new production that addresses racial and social biases he says he's witnessed growing up as a queer Mexican-American. Arts correspondent Angela Du takes us to Pilsen for a breakdown on that production.
It was after Ricardo Gamboa returned to Chicago after a decade of travel that he found himself eager to share the story of a community he felt was fleeting.
And beat me screaming faggot over and over.
Part of what I was grappling with was that our history was like a ghost, that our community was becoming a ghost. And then, not long after I came back to Chicago, Trump was elected. And so there was another haunting that was happening, and that was the violence and the racism that Trump's administration meant for a lot of people, and you know, and including me. And those two things, right, like the election of Donald Trump or gentrification, seem like two disparate realities. But what I realized was that they really weren't. They were entangled realities. And so that is kind of like what the genesis of the play was.
And so The Wizards was born. In short, the story follows the lives of a black and brown queer couple who returned to Chicago after surviving a hate crime. And after connecting with a Mexican-American Motown cover band called The Wizards, they become faced with a task that forces them to address societal issues that Gamboa says have plagued the country for decades.
The Wizards isn't an easy play. It's a hard play. It deals very bluntly with issues like racism and homophobia, violences like gentrification, like war, like white supremacy. But I'm hoping that it does it in a way that forces us to have different types of empathy and understanding for each other.
You looked at it, you're lying. I didn't look at it.
A fellow Wizard and Chicago native in the production agrees.
I mean, it's just necessary to still see the stories that, like, we'll tell each other in our own neighborhoods, but a lot of us are being pushed out of, and so less and less of those stories are ever being told. So I think it's important to keep it on stage, even just as much as we can, just so we could still show people who we are and who we were.
But the story goes beyond these everyday parallels.
The play deals with magic, you know, supernatural totems like the Ouija board. You know, those things become lenses to explore these like larger social issues like racism. We definitely wanted to have this play occur during this Halloween season and overlapping with Dia de los Muertos when the veil is thinner between the worlds.
As for the Wizards, well, they represent more than just diverse tunes.
Gotta head out by 8. That was so damn early.
Part of what I thought about, you know, again, were my parents' stories. I identified so much with something like Motown, which was like, you know, the songs of another racialized urban diasporic population, Black Americans. And so that kind of became, a way to talk about, race and surviving oppression.
Get a girl, fall in love, have kids.
One of the things that oppression does is it deprives us of love. The love that we can give to each other, the love that we have to give to ourselves. What I think this play focuses on is precisely that, and thinking about love in radical ways. Love of community, love for each other across difference and things like that.
I'm gonna get out of here.
For Chicago Tonight Latino Voices, I'm Angel Ito.
You can actually see the Wizards at the APO Cultural Center in Pilsen through November 19th. And that's going to be our show for this weekend. Don't forget to tune in to Noticias Univision Chicago every weekday morning. I'll be waiting for you. And now for all of us here at Chicago Tonight Latino Voices, I'm Alex Hernandez. Thank you for sharing part of your weekend with us. Buenas noches.
Closed captioning is made possible by Robert A. Clifford and Clifford Law Offices, a personal injury law firm pleased to give back to the community through numerous charitable initiatives.